Some say for nostalgia, there's nothing quite like music. And for me at least, the soundtrack to this 1988 16-bit mega success certainly qualifies for that. Starglider 2 arrived on the scenes towards the end of the 80s, itself a sequel to the hugely successful Starglider that came out in 1986. This game arguably displayed for the first time the true potential of the 16-bit hardware, which at the time was still relatively new. By the end of the 80s, 3D graphics were by no means a new concept. However, up until that point, the vast majority of 3D games relied very heavily upon wireframe graphics. Starglider 2, however, went much further with the use of fully filled vector graphics. Now, video gaming in the 80s was a very niche hobby, so it made sense that many of the games were also from niche genres of fiction, sci-fi being one of these genres which was extremely popular. Space games then were a huge deal. Starglider 2 took this entire genre and put legs on it. Not content to be a simple arcade shooter, it extended its reach to become what was, for the time, a very complex game with a lot of depth. Oh, and it also had space wows. The game had it all. Combat, spaceships, space travel and planetary landings, not to mention epic underground tunnels among many other things. Starglider 2 then was not only widely popular with the gaming public, but it was also lauded by the gaming press. The Games Machine magazine said Starglider 2 is surely destined not only to break software sales records, but most likely increase hardware sales too, as it perfectly displays the potential of 16-bit machines. Zap, a very popular magazine of the time, said words really cannot describe the quality of the graphics. However, just about the best we have seen on the 16-bit machines is pretty accurate. Now, it's fair to say that a lot of people actually pointed out the graphics. Of course, this was remarkable for the time, but really it was the gameplay where Starglider 2 really did excel. Given a fighter ship called the Icarus, it was the player's task to take on the growing Egron threat, an alien species who were originally defeated in the first game. In Starglider 2, the aliens return, amassing in the Solis star system, and here players have access to 5 planets and their moons, along with the ability to freely and seamlessly travel between those worlds. Now, graphical power being somewhat limited at the time, the planets featured a chessboard-like surface, and this was more than enough to convey speed and distance. Each of the worlds would feature different coloured surfaces as well as different enemies, thus this offered up a variety and the sensation of physically having travelled from one world to another. Now, we'll have a look at the gameplay in just a moment, but before we get to that, let's go and have a look at the box itself. Now, in the 80s, just like in the 90s, video games came in pretty large boxes. Starglider 2 didn't have the largest of these, but it was, I'd say, mid-sized, and of course it came with all the extras you'd expect. Now, on the box you would have seen this is the Atari ST version, but inside it's got Amiga Atari ST guide. Now, the great thing about Starglider 2, and it didn't happen all that often, was that we got both the Amiga version as well as the Atari version on the same disc. In fact, the save game was compatible on both machines, so you could play the game on Amiga and then head on over to a friend's Atari and play there. The game also came with a novella, and this was well worth reading. It got you in the mood for the game and explained all the back history as well as the lore. Now, of course, without access to the internet, everything had to be in the box. You needed to have all the instructions and a manual. Many games came with a quick guide, and Starglider 2 was no exception to this. Now, although the game had quite a lot of depth, it didn't have a massive amount in the way of controls, so this relatively short pamphlet here was more than enough. The play guide was very interesting though, because it gave you all the background and history on each of the planets and the moons. So all in all, a very nice package, extremely well presented, and of course we shouldn't forget that it also came with a cassette tape featuring the soundtrack that you heard at the start of the video. Jumping into the game today, it's easy to see why game players of the 80s would have been so impressed with the graphics. Do keep in mind that these images would have been on a smaller and far lower resolution screen, and therefore looked a lot less blocky back then. The draw distance, however, is another matter and was extremely low. So low in fact that enemy ships would fly in and out of existence as they moved beyond the game's draw distance and then returned again. The responsiveness of the controls are great and the ship is very manoeuvrable. The combat was fun but did take some getting used to. And one of the most impressive areas of the game, for me at least, was the ability to fly down inside the planets through these massive tunnels. These space whales also stick in memory, but it really was the box art and music which, perhaps unsurprisingly, bring back the memories of the game. Here then, in 2018, it's now somewhat of a forgotten title, overshadowed by the great games that came in later years. Ultimately, Starglider 2 was a testament to what games in the space genre can and should be, and like many of the best titles, it took full advantage of the hardware of the time. But beyond that though, it was perhaps one of the best titles that inspired both the player's imagination as well as the desire to explore and save the galaxy. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys and girls next time.